Welcome to another session of hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development in Education on Live. And what have we got today? We've got Sir David Carter. Sir David Carter, who has been part of our educational landscape for, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, but for decades, helping sculpt where we are today and trying to influence schools and school leaders to make the right decisions in terms of school improvement, development of staff. We're now working for Ambition Institute, and the session will focus on how do we develop our leaders, or how schools develop leaders for the future. But it's actually quite good that there's actually a new book that he's collaborated with. It's Leading Academy Trusts. It's available on pre-order on Amazon at the moment, but it's actually it's looking at the journey of maths in terms of why some fail and why some don't. So worthwhile having a look at that. If you are on Twitter, we will be sharing the details of that, but it's a really good look at some of the journey of where we are today and how we can actually move forward, learning the lessons from the past. For those of you that have joined us before, welcome back to us. And I know that times are becoming more challenging in terms of your commitments with your schools. Twitter today at Chiltern TSA. Make sure you go over there and follow that. We've got Victoria Abbott, who's doing the Twitter takeover today from one of the Bedford Academy chains. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into Sir David's presentation, and then we will answer some of the questions that you've posed live. As I said, your questions, your thoughts, your comments are so valuable to us. It really helps us think about what we're doing and what we're delivering to you. And obviously Sir David will be answering any questions during the video by typing. So here's Sir David's video. See you soon.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about something that I think is a really important part of what I do, but also in terms of one of the challenges for the sector, which is succession planning, and how do we build our next generation of school leaders. My own experience of succession planning is an interesting one, and probably not the model I'm going to talk to you about this morning. In Easter holidays 1997, I took up my role as deputy head at a secondary school in Gloucestershire, having been head of creative arts at a school in Dorset. And at the end of my first week, the head invited me to go for a beer with him, and I thought he was going to tell me about what a wonderful first week I'd had and how impressed he was and how delighted he was he'd appointed me. Instead of which, he told me that he was leaving and he was taking up a new role himself in another school in September. And that I was going to be the acting head of the school when the school came back after some holidays. So this is the ultimate sink or swim moment. My own preparation for deputy head, I was thinking that was a big role and a big step for me, and now I found myself in the role of being acting head. But it is one of those moments where you just have to take that opportunity. But I share that with you because that is not the way to do succession planning, obviously. And what I want to spend the next 20 minutes is telling you a little bit about, I think, what some of the solutions are to that. I want to start by sharing this quote with you. How do you remain loyal to your values, but deliver the right messages at the same time? Because leadership development and succession planning is about recognizing the challenges that new roles present. But it's also, I think, a really important part of understanding how your values and your beliefs underpin the way that you work at every level that you decide to operate at. And I think the values and the behaviors that you exhibit as a leader are a really important and integral part about how we build great leadership capacity for our sector. So I wanted to start with that quote. But to get into the detail, I think it's quite important to think about what do we mean by succession planning. And I think it starts from my view about the degree of readiness that anybody can realistically be. And I think it's probably around 80% ready. And that the remaining 20% comes from the experience that you get from doing the job as you grow and you mature into it. The example I gave you about my own experience in 1997 is probably the 80%, 20% the other way around. But when you're thinking about next roles and we're thinking about developing our leaders, let's be more relaxed about thinking they've got to be the finished article on day one, and think about how we support them through the first 100 days of a new role, the first 200 days of a new role, to move into that role and to be confident. There's a very legitimate question, I guess, about your school investing in you personally, even if the benefit of that investment pays off for another school. But I think that's okay, because actually this is where we think about system generosity. We think about preparing people to be great leaders in the education system. And of course, we want that to be in the schools that we lead and with the children that we're closest to. But if you develop somebody who goes on to have a fantastic impact anywhere else, that's a good thing, surely. I think there's something about the blend of it being partly about a program or a course, but not exclusively. And I want to talk a bit more this morning about the kind of experiences we should be giving leaders as we think about their development. And then the point I made a moment ago with that quote about how do we align personal values and belief with organizational values and belief that enable that leadership to flourish and to make the difference and the impact we want it to. So succession is really important, but it matters from 2 points of view. Succession planning, of course, matters for the individual, but it also matters hugely for the school as well. Because the school that you're working in now, where you're going to take on your new leadership role, or particularly if you're moving to a new school, the vision and the values and the leadership ethos is already in place. And one of the things that you have to wrestle with when you take on a new leadership post is whether or not they're attuned between the values of the school that you're about to work in, or the new role that you're about to take on in the same school, and what you personally believe in. There's a brilliant book by Bob Anderson called Scaling Leadership, and he says leaders bring the weather with them. And I think that's a great quote. And what I think that means for me is that when you're thinking about the many things that are in your mind, some of which are challenging, they're upsetting, they're difficult, if you show that to people as you walk down the corridor, or you show that in the meetings that you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, it will create a different impact than if you have the really positive, upbeat, brief conversation in the corridor with people. It's the ultimate picture of that duck that's gliding serenely across the water, whilst underneath the water, your legs are flapping like mad. And it's that challenge, I think, about how you bring the weather to your organization. And the new leader has to be able to challenge the orthodoxy of the school that they're working in, whether it's the same school or a new school, to challenge whether the improvement plan is the right one, without making people believe that change is about to become something that is going to come from the top down on them very quickly. And how we manage change and how you establish your credentials to manage change are really important, I think, around that, which is why it's worthwhile taking time to understand the culture of the school, understand the challenge that you've been asked to address as a new leader before you start making too many decisions too quickly, so that you have the opportunity to talk to lots of people and to think about what their views are of the things that work and the things that need to change and become better. When we're thinking about leadership development, I think it's worth just reflecting on some of the things that we need leaders now to be good at. And I don't just mean the challenge of leading through this particular era of the COVID-19 scenario. I'm thinking about leadership for the next 5, 10, 20 years and what the things are that leaders need to be good at. And I think there are 6 things, there's more than 6, I'm sure, but the 6 things that I think are drive my thinking around leadership development when I'm preparing for it or I'm leading programs. The first one is about ethical leadership in a collaborative context. There's a lot of work that has been talked about with ethical leadership, which is really, really important about what the values and behaviours are that drive that. The Nolan principles of public life are a really good guide around that as well, if you're not familiar with those. But thinking about what anchors you to your roots of what you believe in is a really important part of how we think about leadership development. The second one is about building cultural capital. How do you build the cultural capacity of your organisation? I don't think you can mandate culture. I think you have to build culture as an expression of values and behaviours, which is why that point about your own personal beliefs is so important when you're thinking about your next leadership development and your next lead stage on your leadership journey. Leaders have to be effective leaders of change. If you're familiar with Kotter's work around leading change, that's a good starting point. He talks about building coalition of support. This is not about imposing change. This is about evolving change through the engagement of people who are going to lead it on your behalf, but who are also going to be the recipients of it. The fourth one is about how do you build really effective collaboration with purpose. Collaboration is a word that we use more and more in our networks, and it's good. It's a good thing to do. But if it's collaboration simply to just be part of something, it's not going to have the same impact unless you really are clear about the purpose of it. And I'd even go as far as to say that some collaborations should just stop because they are a distraction from the core business of improving our schools. But collaboration with purpose really makes a difference. After that, you have to think about your means of communication. How do we effectively communicate? If you think about the typical journey of a head of a school, an assembly with year 11 about the GCSEs that are coming up, moving into a conversation with a couple of heads of department about standards in their organisation, to your next meeting with a parent who has a child that they're worried about, to getting in your car and going to do a presentation at a heads conference about school improvement. All of these things are really exciting elements of collaboration, but you have to prepare your material and present in a different way to your audience. So being able to effectively communicate is a really important part of the role. And I've left this one till last because I think it's the important one. It's about how do you deliver the right feedback at the right time, in the right way, to the right people. So even when you're having that conversation with people about the performance that you're not happy with, the standards that you're not happy with, how do you make sure that your feedback does two things? Makes it really clear about what you want them to do, but also makes it really clear that they believe it's possible and that they're not leaving that conversation feeling demoralized. And that's a real skill. And that's why I think being able to deliver feedback goes beyond just the effective communicator. I've thought a lot about the intelligences that make up great leadership. And I think there are two twin intelligences or multiple intelligences, as I've said on this slide, that I think make a difference. On the left-hand side, you see what I've called operational intelligence. And what I mean about this is the intelligence of how do we lead change? What are the technical aspects that we want to improve? So do you have enough people in your team that know how to deliver improvement in behaviour? Do you have enough people that know how to improve attendance, how to put a great phonics scheme into place, how to improve standards in maths? To think about all those things, about what actually are the strategies that we need to do. And that's why when you're building teams, and I've built many over the course of the last 20 years, you need to be thinking about the different voices around you, not the similar voices. And how do you have different technical experience around you of people who've done this in other settings that can bring this to the table. But if you don't have an emotional intelligence alongside it, you won't be able to take people with you. How do you tell people what their role is in this change that you're about to lead? How do you make people feel confident that whilst you want them to behave differently, to take on a different set of responsibilities, and they want to do it, but how do you make it possible for them to do it? How are you going to be able to explain as succinctly and simply as possible where they fit in the new scheme of things? That's a really important part of it. And the sweet spot is where those two things coincide, which I call the transactional leadership, where you blend the operational understanding of how do we do improvement and what the strategies are going to be with the ability to take people with you who are going to be at the front line of delivering that change in your classrooms. And then I go a stage further, I think, to think about how do we create that culture that we talked about a couple of times a moment ago. And I talk about this leadership pyramid. And on my leadership pyramid, you'll see that children are right at the heart of this, and they have to be. Any strategy that doesn't put children right at the centre of it isn't going to work. But at the top of the pyramid, you've got the workforce, and you have to take them with you. At the bottom left-hand corner, you have parents and carers who may not need to be aware of the technical understanding of what you're leading, need to know that their child is going to a school that's moving forward. And then in the bottom right-hand corner is the community. And I mean the community that surrounds your schools. I mean the people that live in the streets around the school. But I also mean the wider educational community and how you are exposing both yourself and your colleagues to the latest research and latest evidence that enables you to think really optimistically and in an open way about the change that you're leading, following in the footsteps of people who've tried to do this before you. But the pyramid on its own is just a strategy. How you do it is where those four building blocks on the outside of the pyramid come into play. And the first one is about the leader as providing support, how you support your institution to get better. And those are those individual conversations on the corridor, the 100 conversations in a day. It's how you provide for support for people who find this journey difficult, but really want to go on it with you, and how you support them to become the practitioner that you need them to be. In the bottom left-hand corner, I talk about engagement. And leadership is a double-headed coin for me. It's about leading and following. How do you build followership of people who want to follow the guidance that you provide, who see you as a role model, who maybe want to be a leader like you and a better leader than you? But how you build that engagement on the journey that you want people to go on. Because without the engagement of the workforce and without the engagement of the community, it's going to be very hard to do that outside of that particular vacuum. The third one is about building confidence. And there's lots of writing about confident organizations and intelligent organizations. But I think this is about building the confidence that change is possible and that there is a better future. I've said many times that every school in England requires improvement. I don't mean requires improvement in the grading of Ofsted, but the reality that even the most outstanding school in your network will require improvement. It might be a very small tweak as opposed to a systemic change that you have if you're in special measures. But every leader has to build the confidence of the organisation that we can continue to move forward on our journey. And then the final one is leaders add capacity. They add capacity by building the confidence of the organisation, by making teachers see that they can teach differently and better, by building a great curriculum, by thinking about assessment and pedagogy, and by thinking about the deployment of the resource, whether that's time or money, to have the greatest impact it can have. So leaders build capacity. And I think if you build your thinking around your next leadership journey, and you write your application for a leadership post around the pyramid and the 4 building blocks, you begin to talk about how your values impact upon that. Because the morality of improvement, the morality of looking after disadvantaged children is just not up for debate. Everybody in the state education sector has to believe that. But how do you make the difference on the back of that morality? That's what I think makes people stand out and become the kind of leaders that we need. So a lot of the work that I do now with Ambition and with other organisations that I work for is about building future leaders, the next cadre of leaders. And I've been thinking a lot about this. And what you'll see on the slide here is I talk about 3 satellites that orbit around the education system. And these are the satellites of self, organisation, and system. The developing and understanding self is a really important one, and we often miss this out. So all of you that are listening to me this morning, and myself included in this, we are the product of everything that we've ever experienced. Our upbringing, my childhood, my schooling, my university days, the friendships, experiences, good and bad, that I've had, have all helped me to make the leader that I am today. And my vision and my values are a product of that experience. The things that I reject are probably products of the things that I found difficult or I didn't agree with. And the things that the values that are important to me are the product of the experiences that I had. And this goes way beyond the idea of a 360-degree appraisal. This is about what's ingrained in our hearts, in our souls, in our spirit, as well as in our heads. And I think we need people to be able to reflect upon that. Because when we think about the things that upset us and the things that are difficult, that's what we draw upon. I had 2 dreadful experiences as a head where children in my care, not during my care, I might add, but died as a result of illness. And how you explain that to young people in an assembly, how you become part of the support network for families, is something that is not about leadership, it's about what's ingrained in you personally. So understanding self for me is a really important part of this. And if you get that right, then the second satellite about developing and understanding your organisation becomes really possible, because you put your footprint on that organisation. Your values, your beliefs, the things that you care about become the DNA of your schools. And so understanding yourself in order to become even better at understanding your school is a really clear link for me. But that in its own is not enough, because the third element is how you develop and understand the broader education system. So if you understand yourself, your organisation benefits. If your organisation, as a result of your leadership, improves, the education system gets better. So I think when I'm thinking about leadership development, I'm looking to expose people to self, organizational improvement, but also the contribution you can make to the wider system. And I'm seeing it through the lens of those 3 spheres, I think really helps me to think about what I do next. This slide I often call my 4 S's, but it's how I think you can expose people to new experiences that make them better leaders outside of the context of coaching in an education program. And at the base of my pyramid here, you'll see that I like pyramids. At the base of this pyramid is sharing. And what I mean by sharing is the codification of the things that are working in your school. So how do we resist the temptation that every school that gets into difficulty has to start from zero base and reinvent that wheel again when we know how schools improve? How do we codify what effective school improvement has been, and how do we share that more broadly? That's a great thing to be thinking about as part of leadership development. The second I call swaps, and this probably works more effectively in a multi-academy trust than it does in a standalone school, but it's not exclusive to multi-academy trusts. And it's where people who do similar jobs swap for maybe a month, maybe a week, but they get the experience of leading in a different context and challenging their leadership expectations with a different group of children, with a different group of staff. The third part of my pyramid is the secondment. Again, probably linked more to trust and standalone schools, but how do I take and transmit the practice that I've developed in one school that has demonstrably been effective? How do I take that practice and transmit it into somebody else's school? And the secondment route for maybe a month, maybe a half a term is a really effective way of doing that. And then, of course, the final S is the substantive new role, a role that comes up in my trust that I want to be a candidate for, that I want to apply for and I want to get. And having interviewed hundreds of people for roles in schools and in regional schools commissioner teams, obviously in more recent past, the obvious question to ask is, how have you created impact? And I think this kind of experience through the pyramid I talked about, through the barriers that you overcome, and through this slide around the kind of experiences you've had about testing yourself in different settings, is how you build that coherent argument about your impact. So I suppose what I've been doing this morning is it's a bit of a call to arms, and I'm thinking a lot about how do we develop the future capacity. I did an interview a couple of weeks ago where somebody asked me about the thing I was proudest of in the 37 years I've been teaching involved in education. And the answer I gave was that I'm proudest of the 32 people who I'm aware of who are now heads in our school sector. On a very positive note, I didn't put them off, but I think I also hope that I was able to inspire them as well. And that's a great legacy, to think about what you do for the future education system. And every conversation you have is a leadership legacy conversation, because you move that person one step closer to the leader that they want to be. But I thought a bit about what else they need access to. And I think our leaders need access to a coach. I think it's great if they can become a coach, because I think that's a really important part of the reflective leadership experience. I like the fact that people are given a project or a particular strategy to lead, but the accountability has to go with it. So if I'm a head, I don't absolve myself of the responsibility for that strategy. But if I'm going to ask you to lead something, I've got to give you the space to do it well. And so those of you who are developing others, when you do that, make sure you give them the opportunity to make mistakes, but stay close enough to it that the mistake doesn't become a major obstacle. I like the fact that we give younger leaders, middle leaders, a chance to develop other colleagues and to help them to perform better, because it's not just the improvement strategy that's interesting, it's also understanding about why was the improvement required, and understanding that journey from poor performance to strong performance is a really important part of the leadership mantra. I've said to visit 5 different schools. It doesn't have to be 5, it could be 10, it could be 15, but the point being, go and look at other schools. But if you're going to invest time in visiting other schools, make sure you go to schools that are different. Go and look at grammar schools, go and look at independent schools, go and look at schools where people will challenge the orthodoxy of your thinking. Too frequently, I think, people work alongside people who are like us. They believe what we believe in, and it's an affirmation of our intent. Go and look at people who you won't agree with, because in that discussion about what you find difficult to maybe agree with is where the learning comes from. Think about becoming a governor. Brilliant CPD opportunity. If you're in an academy, go and become a governor in the maintain sector. If you're in the maintain sector, go and join the local academy board. But that experience of holding people to account, challenging the orthodoxy of the particular school, it's a great reflective experience. But also publish a blog, write a research project, think about how you give children the opportunity to do different things. You may not lead that enrichment, you might not have time, but create a new opportunity for a young teacher in their first or second year to work alongside you on a new enrichment project. And I want to finish by sharing with you a couple of those leadership experiences that I've had over the last 20 years. And the first one is, I think it's okay to change your mind, but I think it's difficult if you compromise your values and your beliefs, because people see through it. So I think it's a really positive example of humble leadership, that you may have taken a course that is not the right one and you can walk back from it. But if people think that your values change with the mood and change with the weather, then I think you're on a rocky ground, because I think people need to know that what was true yesterday is true today. So it is okay to change your mind, but I don't think it's okay to change your values according to the strategy that you're trying to implement. Maya Angelou, who is a favourite author of mine, said, people forget what you said, what you did, but never how you made them feel. And I've used that many, many times. I think I even had it on in my office wall at one point. And this goes back to those 100 conversations in a day, the single conversation on the corridor at 8:30 in the morning, because those people will go home and say, I had a conversation with the head today. And their mum or dad or their husband or wife will say, well, what did they say? And you'll say, oh, it was a great conversation. They said, and in saying it, they made you feel good about yourself. That's a really important part of leadership. The third one is something that I've spoken about many times, about the fact that school improvement is not a quick fix. A school that is in deeply special measures takes, in my view, 3 to 5 years to improve. And you have to understand that you're on that journey. There are things that you can do in the first 6 months that make the school better, but to move the school from that chaos to something that is securely good takes time. And you have to be patient, and you have to back your strategy so that at one point, 2 to 3 years down the line, the results that you crave catch up with the strategy. But as long as you know that your strategy is right and that you're building the right culture for improvement, it will follow that the results will get better. And my final point is around legacy. And legacy really matters, because the schools that you're working in today, they never belong to us. They belong to the communities that we serve. And our best bet is that we leave our schools in a better state than they were when we joined them. And if we can truly say that we hand over the baton to our successor with a school that's a better position than it was when we started our journey, then it's not just legacy, it means our leadership made a difference. So thank you very much for listening to me this morning. I look forward to answering some of your questions and participating in a discussion about succession planning and leadership development. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Brilliant. So many things resonate with me. So much, and I was looking at the comments there, so much is ringing true, and I've been on Twitter as well, and there's so much to discuss around that, especially in the current situation that we're in moving forward. This is the opportunity that we have to actually start with this reboot that we've had and how we actually create our new leaders moving forward in our schools. So just to remind you, on Twitter, we've got at Chiltern TSA, we've got Victoria Abbott, who's doing our takeover today and has been really active on there. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the E-Stage, Sir David Carter. Good morning, how are you?
I'm really good, thank you. It's nice to see everybody. And it's very weird sitting here watching myself doing a video presentation in my study. but well done to you guys for doing such a good job of making this work.
Thank you. Only works when we've got people like you on board, and it's really appreciated the time that you put in to actually create this. Quite a few questions have been coming up, and I know more will come up as people start digesting what you've said. Where did you want to start, David?
Well, there were 3 questions that I noticed, which I thought were interesting. One was around values and that relationship, I think, between. And the question came on the back of the slide: self-organization and system.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind having a go at that one. There was a really good question about creating impact. And then there was a question about online CPD. So I might start with those 3, if I may.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I think Atia, started off with values.
Yeah. Okay. So I thought that was a really good question. And the reason why I think it's a good question is it's quite a difficult one to answer, because I think the values are so personal to the individual, but they're also very personal to the school as well. And I just don't think that you can mandate values, and you can't mandate culture. The culture in a school is the product of the behaviours of everybody that works there, both the adults and the children. And I think what we do as leaders is we recognise the triggers that we have internally when we see values that we subscribe to, but also when we see values that don't reflect what we're trying to do in our school. And I think the courageous leader, through visible leadership, models the really effective behaviours that lead to the kind of values that are embedded in the school. But they're also not afraid to call out those values that are not helpful, that are counterintuitive to what you're trying to do. And for me, there is a kind of a lineage, if you like, between values. And I made that point in the video about, I think it's very difficult to coach and develop values. It's part of our upbringing. It's part of who we are. It's deep in our hearts as well as in our minds. But those values inform the way that we behave. And it's the behavior that addresses the way that the culture unfolds. So when we talk about school cultures, and you'll see people talk about culture being toxic, which is a very, very aggressive language to use about a culture, because it won't be true of everybody. But often what it means is that it's the behaviors that we're seeing that are the things that are challenging the way that we want to work. And you see it in the relationship between adults and other adults in the school, the way that adults talk to each other. You see it in the relationship between the way that children talk to each other. And you see it in the relationship between how adults talk to children. So when I visit trusts and I visit academies and schools and I'm doing some leadership coaching and we're doing a learning walk, I'm much more interested these days in that relationship between the people of the organisation and how that relates to what I'm being told is the culture of the organisation. So I think it's a great question, but it's a very personal answer that people will need to work through themselves. The second question was about impact. And if I remember rightly, the question talked about, if impact is only about outcomes,
yeah,
do we miss the point? And I think we do. I think I agree with that. Because if we only say the only way that we measure impact is through a metric, we don't learn anything. We only learn what the metric tells us.
Yeah.
And change management, when you're leading change, particularly at scale, depends upon learning from the things we get right and the things we get wrong so that we don't make that mistake again. And I wanted to take that opportunity to talk about how do you lead change and how do you create that impact? And I see it in this way. I think there is some confusion sometimes. And I'm going to make this point for colleagues listening, because I think it's useful to reflect upon this and how you articulate it to other people when you're doing leadership training or you're in an interview situation trying to answer a question from a board. But there is a difference between mission and vision. And sometimes I think people use the same terms to describe the same activities, but I see them as being different. So for me, the mission is why your organization exists. So obviously, my work is largely in the multi-academy trust arena. So my question to Academy Trust is, why does your trust exist? There are 1,500 of them in England. Would we miss anything if we were 1,499 and yours didn't exist anymore? What is the unique aspect of what you bring to the educational landscape that almost nobody else can do? And then I think the vision flows from that, because the vision then is what your destination is to deliver that. And if you think about those two things as being the high level ambition and the vision about where we're going to get to in the next 3 to 5 years, that then flows into the strategy in terms of what you're going to do. And then that enables you to evaluate. Because when projects go wrong, there are all sorts of reasons why they go wrong. The wrong people were leading them. We gave the wrong people that job. We weren't clear enough. People didn't understand what their role was. We didn't spend enough money on it, or we spent too much money on it. We weren't clear enough that things were going in a different direction. We didn't evaluate after 100 days. We just plowed on regardless. So I think measuring impact has got to do two things. It's got to deliver the outcome that we thought of, but it's also got to enable us to learn from the process. And the third question that caught my eye, which I thought was an interesting one, was the question about, because I think it was topical about what we're doing today. This is a brilliant forum for delivering training, absolutely brilliant forum for doing it, and people all around the country are doing it. And I do think that when we go, we reimagine what the landscape will look like. This is one aspect that I think will stay. So a lot of the online communication that we've seen in schools, whether it's meetings or training, has been conceived because there's no other way to do it right now. But if I just reflect on my own experience, when I go and run a training session, let's just say it's for an Academy Trust in Manchester, that's a 10, 11 hour day for me to go and do 2 hours of work by the time I've got to London, got the train to Manchester, done the session and come all the way back. This enables me to really think about how I use my time. I think there's a note of caution I'd use around it. If this is more efficient in terms of how we use time, we need to be really careful that we don't we don't fill the time that we've saved by doing more work. We talked a lot about workload and well-being for many, many years, as long as I've been a teacher. Back into the 1980s, 83, I started teaching, and people have been talking about how hard teaching is. Yet we've never really addressed this. We've got a real opportunity now to think about this. So, of course, we are going to have young people in front of us from 8 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever it will be. But if we continue to stay in school doing face-to-face work 4 or 5 days a week till 7 o'clock in the evening, we'll have really missed an opportunity here. So I think the accessibility is an important part of what we do now. I think the immediacy and the focus is good. I've noticed that in some of the sessions that I've contributed to, or even at ambition meetings when I've been logging into my team meetings, the agendas are a lot shorter. people are thinking, okay, we can't keep this Zoom call going for 3 hours. We're going to do it for an hour. Let's talk about 2 things rather than 12 things. That means that people, I think, are really honed in. And the other thing which I really like about it is that the meeting normally sometimes takes an hour. So we make it last an hour because we said that's what it was going to be. Whereas actually now when the business is done after 40 minutes, people say, thanks very much. And we move on. So I think it's changing the way that we think about work, and what's happening with the way that you guys have been set up in the last sort of 10 weeks or so is remarkable. And other people will want to copy and follow. And I hope that they do.
Absolutely. And I think the thread that's running through, just from a practical point of view, is that at the moment we have the time that we can manage a little bit more, because we're not face to face, especially with our students. And I think the danger and the fear is that all the good work that people do around collaboration, development, etc., in this period of time, when we go back into schools, the fear is that the time has always been an issue.
Yes.
So what advice would you give, linked to everything that you've just said, that you would give to school leaders in terms of how they keep that space open, so the good work can continue, the silver linings from this period, if we're looking at how can they continue to have those within their school cultures? What suggestions would you give?
Just frame that second part of that again.
In terms of how do they leave that space open so people have the time to act on what they're learning, which I think has always been the difficulty in education.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that we have in I'm going to say education leadership. It's probably true elsewhere as well, but I don't know. But let's talk about education leadership. I think we sometimes confuse busyness and activity with effectiveness. And schools are really busy places. Obviously, you've got 1,000 people in a building or whatever it would be over the course of the day. It's full on, and it's why we do the job. It's brilliant. But I think we've got to challenge that and recognise that there is something more than just being busy about measuring that in terms of being effective. And whilst I'm not advocating that people spend a part of every day just sitting in a quiet room thinking, I am advocating that we perhaps do more with less. So when I think about the meetings that I ran as a CEO when I was running the Cadet Learning Federation, the number of plates that we'd have spinning at any one time was ridiculous. I've learned that now. I've reflected on that, because when you go into a national job like the schools commissioner job, there just aren't enough plates in existence. You've just got to be really focused upon what you do. And I wish I'd learned that earlier, because I think we spent more time wrestling with lots of different challenges and saying that's the problem we've got to do next, rather than working out what the solution was. So I do think there's something about, when we're thinking about leading change, to be much more forensic about the particular change that we're going to focus on. Because what I think another thing I've learned is that if you try to solve one problem and you're successful, you actually solve 4 or 5 which you didn't even realize you were doing. So, I mean, a very simple one would be, as a head, one of the things that you wrestle with is the behavior of young people. Even if it's a really positive culture, you can't take for granted that the behavior in the afternoon will be the same as the behavior in the morning. So you're always thinking about that. But of course, if behavior is really effective and children are really learning and engaging, all of a sudden it becomes easy to teach. All of a sudden, more children want to stay longer and do enrichment activities. All of a sudden, teachers start to think, well, actually, that wasn't quite as tough a day as it was 6 months ago. I've got more brain capacity to do something else. I could run a club after school. So I think there is that consequential change of dealing with one particular issue and the flow it has into other solutions as well.
Absolutely. And it kind of links to that. Rachel asked the question, especially middle leader roles, I think are some of the toughest roles out there, because they're being torn from both sides and having to manage expectations on their teams and also the people that they're accountable to. And she said, how do I balance middle leader role with additional responsibilities which will allow me to move into senior leadership? Currently have a couple of unenumerated projects and I'm leading on in my school.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the middle leadership role is one of the reasons why our education system is getting better. And I know sometimes if we read the press and we read social media and we look at Ofsted reports and we listen to the DFE from time to time, you despair and think, where are we going with this? But listen, I started teaching in the 1980s and became a head in the 1990s. And believe me, the education system today is unrecognizable from what it was. We do an unbelievable job in this country. And I think leadership is world class. 21,000 schools in England, many schools dealing with some incredibly challenging contexts where, okay, the metrics might not yet be where we want them to be, but the way that leaders lead their communities where they're vulnerable is unbelievable. And I'd make the same comment about governance as well. I mean, I know we're not specifically talking about governance today, but the governance system that we have, both in the maintained and the academy sector, is the envy of many countries. You think 22,000 schools multiplied by the size of our governing bodies, there is a volunteer workforce doing remarkable work. So I'll jump off that bandwagon for a second, but to answer the question, but I do believe that very, very sincerely. But middle leadership is really important because it's the engine room of school improvement. So as a CEO of a trust or the head of a school, it's my job to be the guardian of the mission and the vision. It's my job to make sure that the strategy stacks up. It's my job to make sure that people understand what the plan is and what their role is in it. But even as a head in a relatively large secondary school, I cannot have the impact in 60 classrooms every lesson every day. I have to delegate that responsibility to my middle leaders. But if I delegate responsibility without support, I'm setting people up to fail. And a middle leadership, I think, is an entity in itself. I think there are many people that will get to middle leadership and really relish the balance between teaching and being a middle leader. But I also believe that middle leadership is a brilliant stepping stone to senior leadership as well. And it needs to be, because that's the talent pool that we're drawing upon when we're thinking about next roles. But it goes back a little bit to the slide that I talked about giving people responsibility. And I think what we do with middle leaders sometimes, and I'll say because I know I did it, so I'm not going to prejudge anybody else, but I would have done this, where I would have given a middle leader a responsibility either to lead a particular project across the school, or maybe just to improve a department or improve a phase that I wanted them to work in. But then I would almost walk the path with them to the extent at which they got used to coming to asking me for permission to make change. And there's no future in that. That doesn't work. You have to be confident to say, look, the responsibility for giving you this job is mine, but you have to have the authority to do that. And I've got in the back of my mind those interview questions, which the person who's asked, Rachel, I think you said, might face one day when she's applying for a senior role, which is, so tell us about a project you had and tell us about the change and tell us about the impact. And impact is a really difficult question to answer if all you've done is manage somebody else's change. So the learning about change management, the learning about the mistakes, the learning about the successes, and how you answer that question from the management of change and management of people, as well as the metric that you use to support it, is the issue. The way that you answer impact is you give them the metric first, and then you tell them how the metric was arrived at. Don't just be proud of saying, my school is now a good school when it was RI. That's the deal, actually. You're meant to run a good school. You're meant to contribute to running a good school. What I'm interested in, if I'm looking to appoint you as a head in my trust, or I'm looking to appoint you as a CEO of a trust, is I want to know, how did you manage impact? How did you measure it? How did you know? And is it replicable? And if we ask those questions, then all of a sudden you have a body of knowledge and a piece of evidence in the back of your mind when that question comes up that flows from your tongue. And that's really important, that you believe it and that you're authentic. Absolutely.
Where did you want to jump to next, David?
I wanted to pick up the one that Stephen asked at 9:28 about, I shared 4 tips. Was there a 5th one? Because I thought that was quite interesting. And I think Stephen's referring to my last slide, which I'm just going to very quickly call back up. But I think there is a number of things that I've probably shared over the years about things that I've learned. One of the ones that I sometimes, it was that one. It was the one that was about not compromising values. The Maya Angelou quote: "People forget what you said, what you did, but never how you made them feel. Improvement's not a quick fix," and legacy with the 4 areas. The 5th one is, if I had done, I sometimes used to say this to my deputies and to the heads in the trust when I'd done a one-to-one with them, which we did fairly frequently. I sometimes used to wonder if there'd been somebody measuring the hour that I'd spent with them, would I have had more minutes in the talking space than I would have had in the listening space? And I suspect, because of the way that I work, I would have probably been talking more than I was listening. If I was going to start out on my headship career again, or I was going to go back and run a trust again, I would spend more time listening and less time speaking. Because if people haven't, by the time we're talking about the detail of a change program, haven't worked out what my expectations are, then there's something gone wrong with my communication already. What's interesting about that, of course, is that when you work in the DFE and you work with ministers, you spend an awful lot more time listening than speaking. And actually, there is a case again where I think I challenge that orthodoxy a bit and probably spent a lot of time speaking fairly frankly with ministers about the world that we occupied and what needed to happen, with varying degrees of success, some of which is included in the book that you kindly plugged for me at the beginning of this session. But I think my fifth one to pick up on, the fifth tip, would be about that amount of time we spend speaking and listening, and how we listen to the communication coming from our school back to us before we give it more to think about.
Let's have a look. So there are a few really good juicy questions, actually.
What about that one at 9:37 from C. Jenkinson? I thought that was a great question. I have 15 years experience in one school. Do you think it's detrimental to dedicate yourself to one school for a long period of time? And 100% the answer is no. 100% the answer is no. And the reason I say no is that it goes back to the point I made about improvement. There is a sense, I think, with some people, probably true at the DFE as well, which again was part of the challenge I think I brought to that organisation, is that school improvement is a quick fix. It's not. It really isn't. If you think about a deeply chaotic school, even a school that's not in chaos but is really struggling, I think you've got probably a 3-year journey to get yourself to the point at which that school is beginning to perform as you want it and probably won't fall backwards. And the reason why that 3 to 5 year journey becomes so important is that if you continually change the leaders on that journey, you almost restart the time clock again. Yeah. And so I think a leadership team in a school is made up of people who have different expertise. My slide on the operational intelligences and the multiple intelligences supports that. But I think the other bit around it is that the type of experience that you have around the table. Because if you continually change your leadership team and every 2 or 3 years it looks different, the risk is that you never build up a DNA of the change program. You never build up a DNA of the organization. And for colleagues who spend 10, 15, 20 years in the same school, they become the pulse of that school. They are both the digital and the real life memory of what happened. And I don't mean from the point of view of saying negatively, well, we tried that before and it didn't work, but they remember the journey that the school has been on. And on a very practical level, I had a deputy head when I was in my headship at Deer Park, that school in Gloucestershire I talked about in 1997, a guy called Ken Minshall, who was a wonderful, lovely man. And Ken had been head of the school, deputy head and a teacher in the school for over 30 years. It was the only school he'd worked in, and he was coming up to retirement as I was appointed. And this will sound a bit of a crass example, but for me it was very important. He knew not just the parents of the children that went to the school, he knew the grandparents because he taught them as well. He knew the uncles and the aunts. He knew the community that the school served better than I could ever learn because I just arrived in it. And sometimes that real deep understanding of the communities that we work in, if we don't have that, it's really difficult. It's one of the reasons why some of the rapid turnaround academies that were fresh started with new buildings and everybody changed, all the new faces came in, all the old guard went out, found it very hard to engage with communities at the beginning of that because you'd lost the trace of that continuity between the past and the present. So for me, it's a really important point, and I hope that's a positive answer to that really good question.
Can we jump to Marion's question towards the top of the Q&A? She asked at 9:27. To do with how do, and I've come across this and I'm sure that you have, how do you encourage people to become leaders when you know they are good if there is little or no interest? There's a reason why I left that one out. No, it's a good question. I will have a go at that one. So I suppose my thoughts around that would be that I wonder whether the viewpoint that says I don't want to be a leader is a forever view or whether it's a now view. And I often wonder why people say that. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be just there's just enough going on in my life at the moment. I often say that the people who we lead
apart from being a teacher of French or a year 1 phonics teacher, they're also a parent, they're also a sibling, they're a son or daughter. Stuff happens in our lives that just gets in the way of the day job, and we have to recognize that and give people space. So it could just be that the mindset is around, I don't have capacity at the moment. Frankly, it could be, I look at the people who are senior leaders in my school and I don't want to be like them. And that's fine. That's not great, but it's a reality. So I think the way that I would work with people who say that, and I've had people that said that in the past, is to try to support them to be the very best version of what they do want to be, which is presumably a great classroom teacher. And I think one of the mysteries for me about the way that our education system is constructed is that if you want to progress, you want your career to develop, and you want to earn more money, you almost inevitably have to get on the leadership ladder. And I think if we were designing an education system from scratch, I think we'd try to find a greater degree of parity between those people who are leading and managing change alongside those people who are teaching in our classrooms, and it wouldn't be quite such a different picture as it is. And so the people should be able to earn what a head of department earns by just being a really, really good classroom teacher. So I think there's an element around that. But I do think that the mindset shifts and mindset changes. And if we invest in people who want to become great classroom teachers, there are other roles they can play. So one of the things that I think works really effectively is a brilliant classroom teacher who has no aspiration to become a leader at this particular point probably is a great person to mentor an ITT or an NQT. Maybe another opportunity is to bring 3 or 4 of those people together who are at the same sort of stage of their career, 4 or 5 years in, maybe a bit more, and commission them to develop a new piece of pedagogy or curriculum design. So they're not leading in a sense, they're line managing people. They're actually leading from a sense of building the intellectual capital of the organization, of the school or the trust. The third reality, I think, is, and I hope this won't come across as patronizing, but I think there is a thing called managing your mates syndrome, where people who were once NQTs or of a similar age, starting within the same couple of years, and out of that group, one of them emerges as a leader and they get promoted in that post, and all of a sudden they are managing the people that they went down the pub with on a Friday night. And I think we underestimate how hard that is for some people. Or you're 25 and you have this responsibility, and actually one of the people in your team is the deputy head of the school who turns up late to your meetings, doesn't plan their lessons, and doesn't mark their work. And how does a 25-year-old have that conversation with somebody 20 years more senior to them? So I think these kind of personal interactions are the things that people often find difficult. The hard conversations, how do you manage those conversations? And maybe the coaching and the mentoring is around that as much as it is around change management. I'm not sure that's a great answer to the question, but
I think it's always difficult because there's a lot of context that you have to consider, like you said. But I think just sharing your thoughts from your experience, I think, are valuable in themselves. Can I pull 2 questions together, if that's okay? Yeah. There was one from Adrian, which says, David, brilliant career. Anything you would have done differently as a CEO? And then we've got, I think it was Louise Lee. Leadership's always a journey. What has been your biggest leadership failure? And if you would go back in time, what would you have done differently given the same situation? So I think they're kind of similar in terms of reflecting back on yourself, one in general leadership and one specifically as a CEO.
They are linked. I think I'll take the second question first, if I may, about the failure question, about leadership failure. I think the first aspect of it is the maturity I've got now from the 37 years I've been in education tells me that I am going to fail. And I think there were phases of my life where I thought I was invincible and I thought I had all the answers, and it was other people's fault when things went wrong, not mine, which is arrogant and immature. And I think by taking a few knocks and feeling the pain of failure, you recognise that actually failure is you have to build that factor into it. But failure is usually predicated around 3 things: failure to be clear about what it is that we're doing, failure to be close enough to the project that we're changing so that we can pick up the early warning signs that things aren't working, and failure to recognise that quick wins matter. So I'll take the last one first, if I may. if you're working in an environment where you're leading a number of improvement strategies, then it's very hard to recognise the quick win that occurs after 3 or 4 months that is going to give you the momentum to propel yourself forward to the next phase. And I think it's one of the reasons, one of the pieces of learning I did was, and it's why I now talk a lot about 100-day plans, because I think there's 100 days is basically an academic year from September to February half term. It's roughly half a year, and then February to the summer holidays. And I sometimes think that we plan our change and our improvement strategies over too long a period of time. So I think my first answer would be the failures that I've been responsible for as a leader have been where I've set the parameter of the change over far too long a period of time without checking in earlier around it. And that's where the 100-day plan comes from it. I suppose that I suspect that there are other examples as well where I can think of examples without actually going into detail of it, where I put too much trust and confidence in people who actually let me down, and said all the right things and told me the answers that I wanted to hear, and I should have checked that what they were telling me was really, really true, and that things were working as well as they thought. And of course, by the time I realised that wasn't the case, I was into intervention mode then, and I had to make changes. That was complicated. And then Adrian's question about the learning of the CEO role. I'll answer the question, but then I'll explain it in a bit more detail. So when I became a CEO in 2007, I think it was 2007, when the Cabot Learning Federation became a multi-academy trust, like many other people at that time, I wanted schools to come and join us. I wanted to get a balance of schools that were in trouble, they were in special measures, they were going to become academies, versus some schools that were not in trouble, but I needed their capacity to come and help me. And I think at that time, like many of us, I probably made a mistake of saying things like to those schools, look, if you come and join us, not much will change. You know, the things that you're good at will continue. We'll kind of give you a lot of autonomy. I want you to help me improve these schools. And that was the journey we were on, and that was how we thought we did it. But of course, if you give schools that level of autonomy and you don't hold them to account in the same level of depth that you do all of your schools, then it's very hard to change that. So I remember a period around about 2010, 2011, I think, when the trust was 5 secondary schools, having a really tough academic year where I was having to tighten up the model from the loose start that we'd made. And it resulted in a couple of the heads leaving because that wasn't the deal that they'd signed up to. But I suddenly realized that the schools that had joined us in 2007 and 2008 that were good schools, actually by 2011 were not as good as we thought they were. And I needed to, I actually needed to bring them into line a bit, and they needed to align around some of our thinking. So I suppose one of the lessons I learned was that whilst there was an inevitability about that era where many of us starting out on this journey had to behave in the same way, I probably would have been a little bit more focused around the things we were going to do that we all did versus the things that the schools were going to have autonomy over.
Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant place to end our session. We're just coming up to 10 o'clock. Time flies. First of all, I'd just love to thank you, David, for the time and effort that you put in actually to prepare this, but also to be part of today's session. So thank you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And so that's the end of another session of #LDeduchat, Leadership Development and Education Online. Lots to take away. We will be sharing as many links as we can on our Twitter handle at Chiltern TSA. So make sure you follow us, referring to Sir David's book, work that he's done before, and anything else. If you want to pose any questions, you'll find his Twitter handle amongst our #LDeduchat tweets this morning. So do pose those questions to him and keep the conversation going about how do we create how do schools create the new leaders for our future? And linking back to all the discussions that we've had over the last week and over many years in terms of representation as well, this is a perfect opportunity to perhaps rethink and realign where you want to be next year, the year after, and moving forward to make sure that we deliver the right education to the communities that we serve. I think my takeaway from this is just one comment that Sir David made, which is schools never belong to us. and that's as teachers, as educators, as leaders, but they belong to the community. So we've got to make sure that we serve the communities that we find ourselves in. And leadership and creating the right leaders for the future is definitely a part of that process. Thank you again, Sir David. So this week we have coming up, tomorrow we have Steve Mumby, who'll be looking at imperfect leadership. And then on Friday we have Oliver Caviglioli, who'll be looking at dual coding for teachers. So from me, Alf Cowshall, on #LDeduchat, another session, another day. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you.